Brian, second to last rankings coming out on Tuesday. Anything that jumped out at you that surprised you a bit in these second to last rankings?
No, it was pretty straightforward because we didn't have any craziness at the top. We've got the de facto championship or quarterfinal game for the playoffs between Iowa and Michigan State, which is set up by both of them winning. So whoever wins that Saturday game in Indianapolis is pretty much assured of getting in. It seems pretty safe that Oklahoma has locked up a spot unless the committee just wants to get really crazy. But from what I'm understanding, they haven't even factored in that Oklahoma is the conference champion yet, so that would give them a little bit more of a boost compared to last year when TCU was third with 1 week left and then fell out of the rankings. I don't see Oklahoma dropping out. The only thing that maybe stood out is we saw what the committee continues to feel about North Carolina, which is not very much. That first loss to South Carolina and playing two FCS teams has them 10th in the rankings, and I don't know if that's close enough to be able to get into the top four if they were to pull off the upset against Clemson, which is frankly the only real chaos that could happen this weekend.
Well, and let's stick with North Carolina for a minute because that's some of the arguments. Booger McFarland from the SEC Network and ESPN was on, Russillo and Cannell or somebody on earlier in the day on Tuesday and was trying to make a case for why he thought UNC, if they can beat Clemson, should be in there. Yeah, they've got the two FCS wins. Their strength of schedule maybe wasn't that great. But otherwise, an undefeated season. And, if you can knock off the number one team in the country, who's been the number one team in the country, that should be enough to get you into the top four. Would that happen? I don't think it would still, though. I think they'll still look at strength of schedule and maybe ignore the conference championship aspect of it.
Well, I think that they would look to another possible conference champion, and that would be Stanford, assuming that they can beat USC on Saturday. They would be 11-2. Yes, they would have more losses than anybody else in the picture for the playoffs, but the strength of their schedule, having just beaten Notre Dame, they would have beaten USC twice. The overall strength of the Pac-12 compared to the strength of the ACC, and the body of work. Stanford having played Northwestern early in the year, though they lost, it still counts better than having beat a team like North Carolina A&T and Delaware, which North Carolina did. I would think that Stanford would end up getting the push into there ahead of North Carolina if they were to knock off Clemson. Now, if Alabama were to also lose to Florida, Florida's too far down, way too far down to where they would be able to jump up. So then maybe North Carolina could squeak in. But I think the last thing the committee and particularly the TV people want is a semifinal that doesn't include the number one team going into last week and also doesn't want Alabama. So I think we're not going to have any sort of chaos, but if we do, it's going to kind of be ridiculous.
Well, you mentioned that Stanford USC, and if Stanford pulls it off and wins the Pac-12, but it would be against a USC team with 4 losses on the season, whereas North Carolina would have bumped off an undefeated number one ranked team. Does that factor in at all as a possible way that North Carolina could find their way into this thing?
We really don't know yet. We only have the 1 year of data, and last year it was all conference champions, and it wasn't so much how strong your win in the conference championship was because it was the 4 leagues that had conference champions. So we would find out if the committee compares beating a 12-0 team to beating an 8-4 team and how much that weighs in comparison to what you did in your first 12 games. I would think that Stanford's overall body of work, not just what they did in that last game, would give them the edge over North Carolina. I think there's the risk of setting the precedent that if you knock off a team in the championship game, you automatically get their spot in the playoffs. North Carolina is the test case for that. Florida, as I said, is too far down. They wouldn't be able to. That would set a really bad precedent if Florida were to get into the top 4, beating Alabama, because then it would put way too much emphasis on winning that game regardless of how good you are overall. And so we'll see how it's going to play. I think that the committee would lean more towards Stanford also from an overall standpoint of the quality of the semifinals.
Well, with what you're saying, which I agree with completely, and we talked about it a couple of days ago on the show, from what you're saying, even if Clemson were to get upset, maybe even if Alabama were to go away, Stanford's going to get that next look, not Ohio State. So in your opinion, is there any way at all that – because Ohio State's done. They're not going to play for a conference title, so they don't have another game. but they do rest on a blowout of Michigan. But there's really no way we're going to see a defending champ in those top 4 teams, right?
It would be very difficult to do that, I guess, through all of that chaos. If we were to have a scenario, for instance, where North Carolina beats Clemson, Alabama loses to Florida, and Stanford also loses, then maybe it would be Ohio State getting in there. But I think only if Michigan State beats Iowa. If Iowa were to beat Michigan State, I can't see the committee putting Ohio State in ahead of Michigan State, considering the head-to-head matchup. They could put them in ahead of Iowa because of the knock of maybe their overall schedule wasn't as strong as the teams on the east side. So the only scenario I can see with Ohio State being to get it is with complete and utter chaos, where essentially every conference championship game, with the exception of the Big Ten, is won by the lower-ranked team.
Well, let's say it all goes the way that it should, which a lot of times it doesn't happen. Clemson wins, Alabama wins, Michigan State, Iowa. The winner of that game, which I think will be Michigan State. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of the Big Ten West. Iowa is undefeated. I get that. But I just think the Big Ten East is maybe a little more talented, if that's the word I'm looking for. They play a different style of football, although Michigan State and Iowa kind of play close to the same. But anyway, if it were to go down, Clemson, Alabama wins. Oklahoma doesn't have another game. Michigan, Ohio State. Does the Big Ten winner move to the 3rd seed, do you think? And Oklahoma come in at number 4?
I think if Michigan State wins, yes. It's gonna slide up to number 3 because of that extra game, and it would have come against an undefeated team. Iowa, I don't know if that necessarily would. There's a possibility, because what I'm thinking is, the way the committee wants to set the rankings, you want to have the number 1 and number 2 teams get favorable locations for their bowl games. Clemson as number 1, assuming they stayed there, or even if they fell to 2, would be going to the Orange Bowl. And then assuming Alabama stays at the 2, then they would go to the Cotton Bowl, which isn't that close to them, but they've played so many games in Texas with their neutral sites. They would have a strong fan base there, and it would feel like a home field advantage, unless they were playing Oklahoma. So if Alabama were 2 and Oklahoma were 3, that wouldn't be fair to Alabama as the quote-unquote home team. And I would think the committee would try to find a way to slide Oklahoma down to 4 and play them against Clemson in the Orange Bowl, which would then move the Big Ten team into the 3 slot and be the unofficial visitor in the Cotton Bowl. I could see it in that scenario. That's how I'm thinking that the Big Ten winner can get the 3.
Brian Pedersen, our guest, college football featured writer for Bleacher Report. It's Ford and O'Brien, ESPN Evansville 105.3 and online, ESPNEvansville.com. Let's move away from the rankings and championship games for a minute. Been a couple of coaching changes, one in the SEC, but not the one that I think people were expecting to happen. As Les Miles, we talked about it last week. There was all this talk about this is going to be the end for him, and where are you going to go from that? And you tread lightly here, LSU kind of thing. But now he's safe, but Mark Richt in Georgia is gone, and we'll get to that situation in just a bit. But so I get the impression Les Miles is at LSU to stay, at least for now. How thin of a string is he on, and what kind of will we see some changes in his coaching staff, perhaps?
I think that is going to be a big part of it. That the understanding was that he has to be more open to change and be less invested in his ways. His offensive coordinator situation is not a very good one. Their offense doesn't have any creativity. I think Cam Cameron is probably going to be on his way out and need to find somebody that can keep up with the advancements in the SEC offensively. So much came into this situation. You wonder how much Twitter and social media and all of that played a role in changing everything, because it seemed like a few days before the game that the indications were the school had lined up the booster money to be able to pay his buyout, and he was gone, win or lose, and then things just popped up. You saw the governor tweeting about his support for it, which made me wonder, considering LSU is having so many issues with funding from the state and having shortfalls outside of athletics, that if Bobby Jindal, the governor, was essentially saying, if you get rid of Miles and fork over all this money to get rid of him, then don't be surprised if your overall funding gets cut even further, because you're showing what's more important to you at this point is spending all this money to get rid of somebody who's been successful. So many things played into that. I'm glad to see him stick around. We'll see how he handles being less in control of the program and having to answer a little bit more to those around him.
One of your, and I can't recall who wrote the piece yesterday on Bleacher Report, one of your colleagues wrote a piece about how boosters and those kind of things, I may be misquoting here, but maybe ruining college football because they've got that ability to do this kind of thing is like, fine, if he's got a $15 million buyout, we got enough rich guys in the alumni association that can throw some money his way, and we'll do it the way we want to do it. Is that something the NCAA may have to step in and go, whoa, we need to slow this down a little bit? There's too much influence outside the university.
I'd be worried to have the NCAA get involved in those things, because then does that mean that they have more of a say in how you spend your booster money on facilities and equipment and all of that? And I mean, that's essentially private money, and the NCAA is a quasi-governmental organization, but really they don't, I know what they want to be with themselves. Do they want to be a government agency where they are regulating donations like you would see in political campaigns, and that there's a limit to those kind of things? But even still, in that realm, people donate money to a campaign, and it's with a understanding, I guess, that you are going to be in favor or against a certain policy down the line, and the government can't say what you do with that. I think a lot of it is just kind of behind the scenes understanding that, hey, we're providing you with all this money. We want to have a little bit of a say in that. Oklahoma State, you look at them with T. Boone Pickens. He pretty much gets to decide what happens with all of the athletics at that school, because without his money, they don't have a say in that. They are an organization on their own. If that's how they're getting their money, then they should be allowed to use it how they will.
Well, let's jump over to the other coaching change, the one that did happen in the SEC, and that's the fact that Georgia decided 15 years under Mark Richt was enough, even though he was very successful in that program, maybe just wasn't able to get what they wanted accomplished done, and they go in a direction and take Alabama's defensive coordinator, Kirby Smart, and you and I were discussing this before we started the interview, that I noticed you had mentioned some things on Twitter or retweeting some people that seemed to, I think, maybe share some similar viewpoints on this as you. Just maybe a head-scratching kind of move to some degree, in your opinion?
Considering all of the talk leading up to during the season about how big a job Georgia is, that it recruits great, it has so much interest in the state, and it's better than almost any other job, even in the SEC, to see them essentially settle, is the word I would say, for a first-time head coach in that position was just very strange. And especially one in Kirby Smart, a defensive coordinator who's done a great job at Alabama. There's no questioning that. But Georgia has a pretty good defensive coordinator on its own in Jeremy Pruitt, who, if they wanted to take a reach for a first-time guy, why not maybe promote within? Unless they were looking to just completely go away from what is already there, and that is likely meaning that Pruitt is not going to be sticking around in Athens after this season. He hadn't been there very long. He'd only been there a couple of years. He'd been at Alabama. He had been at Florida State and had been successful in those spots. So he'd shown that he could win in the South and was involved in recruitment. Why not give the job to him? I don't see what the upgrade was for him, for Kirby Smart rather, over Pruitt, or going with somebody who already had head coaching experience.
Could you say that maybe since the goal of everybody but Alabama in the SEC is to beat Alabama in the SEC, that maybe the thought process is, if we can't beat Saban, let's just take guys who know him really well, and maybe we use his own powers against him to some degree?
You know, I saw a great meme on Twitter last night that essentially said, everybody hates Alabama except for when you need a coach. And that would be a situation right there. You can't beat them, join them. Yes. And so I understand why they're going in that route, but does that mean that another school should be hiring Lane Kiffin because he has been able to do so much with Alabama's offense there? He's got a track record, at least, of showing that he wasn't successful, so maybe you could stray away from him. But I don't know. I understand wanting to go with something fresh. I just didn't feel like that was a fresh change.
All right, one more for you, Brian. We'll let you get going. Championship games this weekend. Do you see any potential surprises there as far as who's going to come out on top?
I think it's pretty much chalk. The only one that is really a toss-up is the Iowa-Michigan State game. How for real is Iowa as a team? Their last 5 opponents were a combined 21-39 since their last important victory against Northwestern. And they won those games by an average of less than 10 points. So they weren't beating up on the weak teams in the Big Ten. They were just kind of doing just enough to get by. Michigan State did a lot of that earlier in the year as well, where they would struggle against teams that you thought that they should throttle, almost as if they were saving themselves. And then they saved themselves and played their best against Michigan State, against Ohio State. Ironically, it's amazing to think that they won both of those games without ever leading with time on the clock. Both of those games they won as time expired, but they did enough to stay in those games to put themselves in a position to win. And I think that's what's going to give them the edge. That's the only game that I think is going to really have any major drama on Saturday.
Well, enjoy it. We know the final rankings come out on Sunday. We'll try to touch base early next week, get some final thoughts from you on those final rankings as we get ready for bowl season. Always great stuff, Brian. Brian Pedersen, college football featured writer for Bleacher Report, joining us on the Menard Studio Hotline. As always, Brian, appreciate the time. Enjoy the games this weekend.
Thanks for having me, guys.